I want to talk about embodiment, and I'm going to relate that to the incarnation, and in particular I want to talk about whether or not digital mediated life is disembodied, or how it might be embodied, and what we mean by that. And one of the things I noticed, very interestingly, reading all the case studies and reading blog reports as we, blog postings as we went through the project, was a sort of line in the sand that got drawn with even our most technologically savvy and sort of saturated media users when asked the question, could church ever be totally online, completely digital? It was a resounding no. So that was the line in the sand. And we get some quotes from the case study. So Jim Rice summarizes a conversation he has at Quest Church in Seattle by saying, quote, "The Christian faith is an incarnational faith. That is, real presence is an intrinsic aspect of the tradition." And then that's end quote. Incarnational presence, according to Gail Bantam, who is Eugene Cho's co-pastor at Quest, says more about sacramentality and the necessity that sacrament requires a central Christian commitment to, quote, human interaction with God and with one another, end quote. In his case study for House of All Sinners and Saints, Jason Biasi reports a similar theological argument against online-only church. Quote, "This is a sacramental worship with chant, sacrament, incense, icon, and a flesh and blood neighbor. The bodies of those who have been wounded, who house attends and rehabilitates back to health, are too important to be left to their loneliness-inducing screens," end quote. Or as a congregate at Countryside Community Church, which is the church that hosts and sponsors Darkwood Brew, which was my case study, a parishioner there told me a bit more colloquially, quote, that church are the people I see on Sunday mornings who will make you casseroles when you're sick and watch out for your kids, end quote. So we saw this across our case studies and in other conversations we've been having with pastors and church leaders, that there's a certain point at which digitally mediated technologies won't take us all the way with church. And the argument is almost always, if not exclusively, tied to the doctrine of the incarnation. So you can hear the language even in the quotes that I was reading. The incarnation sort of bounds Christians to our embodied life, sanctifies our embodied life by the presence of God in Christ as a human body that grounds real human interaction. So incarnation equals real human interaction equals embodied interaction. And that is specifically not virtual or digital interaction. So I am a constructive and historical theologian who works mostly on questions of embodiment and aesthetics, but what the body means and how the body conveys theological knowledge. So I want to affirm pro-embodiment, pro-incarnation. But I want to challenge whether or not disembodied versus embodied is the best way to think about the way we actually experience our digitally mediated lives. That is not to suggest there are not things to challenge or question or be concerned about, a pervasiveness of digitally mediated technologies, but if our knee-jerk, to be sort of pejorative, or maybe deeply theological, to more positive response, that's not embodied, so we can't go there all the way. If that blinds us from seeing what might really be going on in our digitally mediated relationships, and to think maybe more carefully about how the doctrine of the incarnation in particular, what light it might shed on interpreting and understanding this new landscape. Before I get to that, I just want to highlight a little more clearly some of the reasons why I think theologically embodiment equals good and embodiment equals incarnation is such an important move for most pastors and theologians to make right now. And part of this comes out, I think, of the last 50 or 60 years in theological tradition, especially thanks to the groundbreaking work of feminist and womanist and other theologians who are pointing to a sort of need to slough off a kind of post-Enlightenment heritage in Christianity, which has degraded and downplayed the importance of bodily experience and bodily knowledge in the life of faith. So despite the fact that officially the church has taught since early divisions or sort of early pronouncements on Docetism and forms of Gnosticism, traditionally Christianity has held a strong line on the essential unity of body and soul for the human person, including Jesus as a human. Recently, theologians in the last several decades have pointed out to us, especially feminists and womanists, that technical affirmation of body-soul identity or unity has not meant that bodily experiences like sex, childbirth, eating, physical labor, pain, emotional experiences in general, those have not generally been elevated within the Christian tradition for many centuries as sources of theological knowledge or for the experience of God. And especially after the Enlightenment and sort of philosophical discourses of the Enlightenment, we could tie that in with like practices of global capitalism, disciplining of the body in certain ways. Spiritual knowledge was what could be had regardless of bodily experiences, something that was assented to by reason or experienced in a spiritual way that was somehow above reason, but not therefore necessarily rooted in our bodies. So this desire to move beyond that heritage, I think, is an important one and a really good instinct, and I think it's part of what drives the moment we're in. We don't want to go back to the bad old days of those loneliness-inducing screens where people are left alone in their private, rational assent to propositions and disconnected from the life of community, from their own bodily experiences, their own emotional lives. And so part of that has led to an increased emphasis in many traditions in Christianity, sort of from the 1960s on at least, to sort of re-understand and cultivate embodied forms of worship and community formation that emphasize vulnerability, interdependence, and connection to one another. And so I don't want to move us backwards in any way. I think we have just begun to sort of shake off this mind-body dualism and remember the importance of embodied practices to the life of faith. And everything I want to say is meant to move us along in that path. On the other way, I want to suggest, and I want to turn to this now, that understanding digitally mediated practices as disembodied is not the best way to actually understand how we experience technology or practice our technology. So I didn't bring it up here with me, but I should have. For the most part, we increasingly, statistically this is true, get online or access digital content via handheld devices. And this is actually interestingly to the conversations raised in the last conversation about class and race equality, that it's this form of technology that is the most democratic in terms of it is it's the most significantly rising form of access is through mobile technology, and among African American and Hispanic communities, it is the predominant way in which internet or digital content is accessed. And I actually think it's the way we're all moving. I mean, the move from the laptop to the tablet, to the mini tablet, the merge between the tablet and the iPhone, to this increasingly mobile, fluid, highly transportable device. And we can start to talk, I mean, you know, the next waves of this are, like all of our sci-fi fantasies, devices that cease to even have to be held or cease to have to be manipulated, you know, actually become increasingly integrated into our actual bodies. So on a simple level, we don't have to be in a particular place to get online anymore. So even that language, going online, we do still use it. It's like, oh, that's online content. But we don't go online anymore. This used to mean something. I remember my first times going online meant literally I had to go up to the study in my parents' house, unplug the phone, plug the computer into the router, take over the phone line for a set period of time, dial in, and me and the computer were going online together. Similar language of cyberspace. This was, the way we talked about what the internet was in the 1970s and 1980s, specifically a little into the 90s. Cyberspace, a different space, another realm, outside the realm of lived reality or embodied reality, even virtual reality. So we've got one reality, and then we have a virtual reality, some kind of shadowy other world that we enter to become people that we've never been. And this was, in fact, like a utopic dream of what the internet was supposed to be in its early ages, a genuinely alternative space. And it was mostly peopled by users who were creating radically different identities and self-expressions and forms of community. This is not actually what we do anymore, by and large. I mean, hardcore early adopters bemoan the fact that the internet has become so mundane and so boring and so basically just an extension of our everyday lives. So these fantasies we have, the Matrix, where we're all like gelatin pods, like having our memories like, sucked out of the back of our heads, where we live in a virtual space completely disconnected from our bodies, or even the stereotypes that still persist about hackers and gamers, sort of overweight and pasty from lack of sun exposure and like completely devoid of normal social skills because they're lost in like another plane of existence online. That's not actually how most of us experience digital technology. And increasingly, computer scientists and media theorists are using a term, X reality, so X, like the letter X, reality, to describe, in fact, and that's not online, it's not cyberspace, it's not virtual reality, it's X reality, and the X meaning to cross over. So it describes a pervasively networked landscape in which the continuum between digitally mediated life and so-called real life, or what is sometimes called face-to-face life or geographically proximate life, is fluid. So we all, if you're on Facebook or Twitter or any other form of social media, you use email or even text, I imagine most of you don't think you've created an alternate identity in some shadowy other reality called virtual reality, in which you are somebody disconnected from the person you are. Rather, these are platforms we use to be ourselves across time and space and in new configurations of time and space. So the big difference there is between geographically proximate and not proximate. And it's interesting that what media theorists say, so what does X reality do? What does it allow? They talk about it in terms of presence. X reality allows us to say, I am here. We are here, even when we're not actually technically, geographically there. So it's a way of describing the reality that most of us live and increasingly live with our digitally mediated technologies that presses against the idea that this is somehow an alternative identity to ourselves or a less embodied one. So a young mother wrestling her toddler into a grocery cart while at the store simultaneously is like holding him down and updating her Facebook status with her other hand. Instantaneously, within a few moments, gets replies from her mother-in-law, 7 of her best friends, all in different geographical locations, offering support and encouragement and in the sort of travails of raising small children. And that mother in that particular moment is no less embodied, no less physically present to her toddler, who wouldn't let her be in another plane of reality, no matter how much she wished it, or nor less so to her community, which is spread geographically around, through time and space. So if this does describe somewhat accurately where we actually live in terms of how digital technologies, mediated technologies work in our lives, we can start to think not about my presence in real life versus my presence online, but rather the ways in which my presence is mediated by technology or by lack of technology as a way for me to be present, the same me, the same self, to different people in different times and places. This doesn't mean that there's no difference between digitally mediated interactions and face-to-face interactions, and that we don't need to try to discern what those differences are, what they mean to us, why they matter. But to press against the embodied versus disembodied dichotomy is the best way to describe what's actually going on. And one reason why I think we need to do this, and I alluded to this, but is that the sort of, when you look at reports of where we're headed in technology, and most of these reports are like shockingly and like startlingly accurate. If you look back several years, like where we're supposed to be 3 years ago, and we're like right there where we're supposed to be. Like, what are going to be the next technological inventions? And Kathy's nodding because she heard some of this at another talk we both had together. Is the ways in which technology is pushing us to both platforms. So right now, even just via our iPhones, I keep reaching. Literally, I'm like, "Where's my iPhone?" It's like my arm has been amputated. I need just to hold it. Just let me hold it.
Buzzing the whole time.
Oh. Okay, great. so I won't even look at it. Look at this. No, but I think, so even through these technologies, sort of, it's called augmented reality, which I've been playing around with a lot, which you can do with your phone, where you hold up your phone to something running a certain app, and it shows you digital content about whatever the real-life object is that you're looking at. This is Google Glasses, which Google is unrolling slowly, and I kind of can't imagine they're going to take off because they just don't look that attractive, but the idea there is that you wouldn't even need your phone. It would actually be a pair of glasses that you wear, so that your real life is augmented, is layered with digitally mediated information. So when you see a monument, for example, when you're touring a new city and you're like, what is that statue? You don't even have to Wikipedia it, or like Google Maps and try to find it and then Wikipedia it. You just look at it with your Google Glasses or hold your phone up to it, and information about it will appear in Google Glasses, literally floating like a digital layer in front of you or on your screen. And obviously we can all imagine that like all of our worst fantasies or our best fantasies, that then it'll just be a little chip behind your ear, or but the ways in which this merges our sense, or it expands our sense, or challenges us to think about what these bodies are, and this relationship between our brains, which are of course part of our bodies, but the ways that our brains interact with our own sense of the extension and limits of the rest of our body. And I think if we get fixated too quickly on digital equals not embodied, we are actually missing what's going on in the ways that our bodies are being reimagined and reconfigured, with or without our permission, consciously or just through our use, just through participation. And I'm not saying this alarmistly. I'm not actually sure that this is something to be worried about, but if it is, we need to be aware of what we're actually talking about and not jump so quickly to this sort of sharp divide. Because increasingly the divide is what's blurring in general. Our bodies are becoming expansive, and attachments to our digital technologies and the possibilities they open. So that said, I do want to suggest that if the incarnation isn't the place to go to say, this is not embodied, therefore bad or wrong or not all the way, what could the incarnation offer us in terms of reflection on this X reality that we live in? And I offer, in my longer essay, I offer like 3 different ways we could think through the incarnation. I want to talk about what I actually think is driving most of our concerns, at least at this moment when we worry about disembodiment or why the church couldn't be completely digital. And I think it's less to do with lack of our real presence, but actually an overextension of our presence. So it's what could be called a dissipation of our attention, or dissipation of our energies. So it's not actually that I'm not present via digital technology and that's why that's bad. It's that I'm so present, that it is in fact really me, and I'm so present to so many people in so many platforms at the same time that I don't have much left to give. So it's about dissipation, not disembodiment. And to suggest that the incarnation then can become a model of concentrated attention. So one way to think about the incarnation, or one way I think about it, and I'm borrowing a lot from Simone Weil here, is not that in Jesus we have the only point of revelation from God, but we have a sort of guaranteed touchstone, a place to focus our attention. So in the midst of distraction, we can turn our attention to that moment, this one particular human life, this one particular experience, and in meditation on that, focus our attention, which then ideally opens us up through that to, again, back to the full embrace of the goodness of all forms of life and revelation where we may find God. But it may be there that that doctrine could be employed for practices of attention and sort of coalescence, or giving us focus in training our spiritual and physical senses in a new way again, in the midst of this mediated and expansive moment. That's comments. Thanks.